John, I've just started. Do you want me to start right from the beginning again, or is it fine if I just go on?
Hi, it's Daniel here. I think it will be more convenient if you start from beginning, just to cater the other student as well when you post it on
Okay,
website.
thank you. Okay, thank you. Let's start at the beginning then again. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, Today we are going to look at how we structure our research. This is not a linear process. As you can see, we go back and forth in the process. And because we go back and forth, we can get lost. We don't know whether we're in that part of the process or whether we are on that arrow. And what's very important is that you cannot consider any part of the research project finalized before you've handed in your last assignment or your thesis, because we go back. When we write our methodology, we go back to our literature review to make sure that we do not make mistakes that have been previously made in the literature review, and we go back to see which methods are acceptable in my discipline. So, and because we move up and down and around in this process, it becomes very easy to get lost. And when we get lost, our arguments are no longer logical. And when our arguments are no longer logical, we get bad marks, and our research does not make sense. So what I've done is I looked at different kinds of writing, and I've assumed that most of you are not involved in different genres of creative writing. So from the work I've seen up till now, most of you do business writing. So it's important to see what exactly is the difference between academic writing and business writing. Business writing, first of all, is very formal, and it uses the third person. It's very important that you keep to the third person. You don't say, I think. You say, there is an opinion. Or in this discipline, it is assumed. So you use the passive to avoid I. And it's especially important right at the beginning of your academic career to avoid I. Maybe later on, when you have a more sophisticated style and you have settled into your academic style, the I may be used in the right place. But I actually want to tell you, if you are an honors student, avoid I like you are avoiding the COVID virus at the moment. You have to have social distancing with the I's in your life. And then academic writing is fact-based. Even those of you who do research, I've seen quite a few development theories. So even if you work with abstract theories like in management, it is still fact-based. It's not an opinion. And then Longer sentences are acceptable, and that is one thing, because I've worked in schools for such a long time before I did my master's. It took me, I think, about 6 months to start using longer sentences. And when you use longer sentences, I have posted to the files already a list of transition words. So you can't merely string along sentences with a comma somewhere. If you want to combine two sentences, you must have a transition word that explains to. Please, the microphones must be on. Whose microphone is on? Please, that microphone must be on. There's also a radio on. Please put that off.
His voice. Trying to make a play on this guy. There's something going down a week from Thursday, and they were not happy about what he found.
I'm sorry, the technical assistant, please mute everybody.
Live. Anybody and I don't know.
What in what it would?
Hello?
Hello?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you.
You can hear me. Oh, I think I'm new on this. I just recently downloaded the Microsoft app, so I wanted to join on the conversation.
Okay, but we usually keep the, if you look on your screen, can you see my screen? Okay, do you see where I'm pointing at the moment? There's show conversation. Now, what we usually do is I speak and then I interrupt myself, and then I look in this, in the chat to answer the questions after a while. Is that fine with you, please? Okay, so
yeah,
please remember. Okay, so please mute. So longer sentences are acceptable. And when you decide to combine sentences, you must use a transition word to take your examiner on your logical route so that he can see why you think these two sentences belong together. Now, in business writing, it's courteous and clear, but it is not as formal. At the moment, one gets a lot of promotional material because the businesses want to keep in touch with their clients or customers. So what would be a good idea would be to compare any of these promotional letters you get from Sanlam or the bank, those are the ones I get, and compare the writing style with what you have read for your literature review, so that you can clearly see what's the difference between formal writing and courteous writing, because there is a difference. Those Sanlam and Old Mutual communication, and for that matter then Momentum as well, and from any of the banks. I don't work with Capitec anymore, so I wouldn't be able to speak about Capitec, but compare those communications with the formal letters you've seen in your literature review. Then in business writing, we often get, even in the reports that you write at work, you are being paid to give an opinion. You had to investigate some matter for the company, and now you have to give your opinion. And that is different from giving a conclusion in formal writing. Again, if you have business reports, I know PwC has very strong templates where if one of their consultants have to write a report according to which they have to write. And if you can get hold of such a report and compare it to the conclusions in your literature review, it will also give you an idea what the difference is, and it will be easier for you to work with that. Some people don't put off their, I don't have a button for mute all. Please mute. The next thing is that when we do business writing, we use shorter sentences. It's obvious. FNB, Capitec, ABSA, maybe I had to fill it in somewhere, but they don't know my qualifications. They don't know my reading level. So what they need to write courteous and clear, but they better use shorter sentences, otherwise people can't understand them. If you think of a contract, think of your rental contract or a hire purchase contract. It's obvious sometimes they have convoluted sentences. It's not properly constructed longer sentences that they have in some business writing. It's simply bad long sentences. Let's quickly, before we go on, I just want to have a look if there are any questions. Felicity asked, may one use the phrase, one may conclude? Yes, you may. Just remember that that is quite towards the end of your argument, but you can use one instead of I. Although, again, be careful that all your sentences then aren't structured exactly the same. Now, the standards for academic writing. First of all, there must be evidence of adequate and appropriate background reading, which means that and that you do by incorporating the information from your literature review must be like a golden thread in the rest of your writing, because that is how you ground your work. Remember, we spoke about the theoretical framework, and that is how you base whatever you are saying on your theoretical framework. And that makes the difference between a business report and academic writing. The next is that you have a clear statement of aims and relevant selection of content. If we think back to that model of what research looks like, can you see why it's so important to have a clear statement of what your aims are? And those refer to the research question and the questions that grow from your research question. Because if you're in the middle of your methodology, you should go back to your aim and say, is my methodology working towards that aim? Sensible, I like the word sensible, because often people, last year they had some or other assignment, I think it was in research methodology for one of the modules, where they had to actually do research in UNISA. And this one guy said he's going to send questionnaires to all the postgraduate students. I don't know how many postgraduate students there are, but how many of you will actually make the time to fill in a questionnaire? So sensible means that it's also practical. It can work in practice, that you have taken time and money and all those practical considerations you've taken into account. And then evidence of systematic thought and argument. If we, I don't want to toggle between the slides too much, but if you keep that slide in mind, do you see that how systematic you need to be if you want to keep on with this process? That you need to be at all times, you need to be aware, where am I in this process and how did I get here and where am I going? Then clarity of expression. It's interesting. I think I'll post the article to the chat so that you can read it as well. But they've done research, I think it was at the British University, where you have students coming to the university all over the world. And all of a sudden, all those second language speakers need to be able to express themselves in academic English. And it was found that if you give them structures, linguistic structures, that their writing actually improve. And if I now have to go on with research, I would say that students who use the correct linguistic structures tend to move towards interpretation and away from plagiarism. And I'll illustrate it later when I'm going to speak about the verbs in particular. For next week, I'll try and design a list, a structured list for you. But I first wanted to complete this lecture, because often from the questions that you pose in the chat, I see what your needs are, and then maybe I need to do extra research to answer your needs. The next one, and I can't, this one should have been in red. Careful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, usually the first assignments do not weigh as heavily as the later ones. So it's very important. Who is unmuted at the moment? Accurate typing means that you choose the correct font, somewhere in your tutorial letters, they will tell you what the font should be and what the line spacing should be. And often these first assignments are marked merely on the technical matter, because we need to teach you the conventions before you can do proper research. So look for the font, look for the line spacing, and especially look at the requirements for the table of contents. When I studied, and I want to say that is an academic convention, that your table of contents have your headings and your subheadings, and they are numbered according to the convention set up by your module. What I found when I did my master's was that the lettering concept required by the university did not line up with Microsoft's numbering system. Sort it out. If you don't know how, write to CT in TUT, and one of the technical people who know more about Microsoft will help you. But it's very important that you sort that out. The people that I can see currently are all muted. So please mute. Another mistake that you can make is that you enter instead of using a page break. Remember, if you go back and edit your work, those enters, they will then not be in the right place. So if you need a new page, you start a new page break. Also find out in your tutorial letter exactly what the requirements are for headers and footers, and whether they require you to have certain headers and footers, and make sure that you make that correctly. And the conventions of academic discourse, that is what we are going to speak about now, and make sure that your bibliography or reference list at the end is according to the system required by your module. And then the next one, observation of length requirements. I saw some assignments in which they tell you the introduction should be so many pages, methodology so many, literature review so many. Don't ignore those instructions, because another way is by the instruction verbs in the assignment. So look at the length requirements. So because that moves back to the systematic thought and argument. If you get stuck into your introduction and that is 3 pages, then you will have a problem fitting everything into the 10 pages that you need to submit. So the observation of the length requirements actually is very much part of the systematic thought and argument. Now, how if my writing should be, oh, let me rather go to your chat line now. Okay, I see no questions at the moment. So if I want to make my argument fact-based, where do I find
Hi, Ms. Talia. It seems you muted yourself. Can you please just unmute and then start from where we stopped, please and thank you.
Okay. Oh, I see. There's a gentleman on that was unmuted that I mute. There, I've now muted the right person. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. If we need to have a fact-based argument, where do I find the proof for my argument? And that is logical reasoning. That is especially part of where you do your literature review, because you look at the evaluation and analysis of data. And go to some other dictionary, or you can Google it and look at the difference between infer and deduct, and make sure that you use them correctly. Because in deduction, we have a general idea. Oh, she is, sorry, I thought there was somebody not muted. In deduction, you have lots of information, and from that you come to a conclusion. When you infer, you have information, and from that you try and move to the general. But of course, all of that have limitations. But the logical reasoning, I think I will make part, the detail of that, I'll make part of the data collection and analysis in the last lecture of this month. Then, when you work with text written by authoritative researchers in your field, and that's now especially with your literature review. Currently, with the COVID crisis, we get all kinds of people who call themselves epidemiologists, and they may, but whether they are authoritative or not, we don't know. I suppose the majority of you have seen that interview between Jono Brandvoet and some other professor from Stellenbosch. I don't know whether they should open up the economy or not. What I do know is that if somebody is speaking about the disease and he's speaking as a businessman, I'll be careful to just accept his opinion, because that's not a peer review. A peer review would be two epidemiologists discussing how do we cope with this time, with the COVID disease that's going around. Do you see? So be careful that if you use researchers, that they have the, I'm sorry, I can hear sound and I'm trying to see. Make sure that they are authorities in their field. And then there might be, your proof might be data that you gather yourself, but that depends on the best practice in your discipline. And it's very important that you know what is the best practice in your discipline. For instance, I've worked with auditors coming in to do the financial statements, and they work according to a certain schedule, and they present their work in a certain way, and those are their best practices. When you go to the doctor, he look at you according to a certain schedule, and those are the best practices of the medical profession. So each profession has best practices, and the data that you gather must be according to those best practices. And that is especially important for those of you who are considering doing interviews for your methodology. So the best practice in your field can include observations of yourself or of other people, and that is often used, and it's quite acceptable if your method of observation is clearly described and other people can follow those instructions. Remember, I told you about the student who used the narrative to find out the relationship between how do you manage a crisis and your faith. And she failed her first methodology. And when we worked through the assignment that she failed, it came about that she didn't put down the requirements for her interview properly. And because that hadn't been put down properly, she couldn't really justify her conclusions at the end. But once we start looking at how are you going to speak, because that was a kind of observation to get the people to tell her the story. And once we sorted that out, we were in the system so that she could come to a proper conclusion. And then also the opinions of people, and you get it all over the show, even on Facebook, where you have to vote whether you want to open the economy or not. So you get opinions, but then it must be, remember the sample, whether you are going to have a random sample or a representative sample, you need to take that into account. And then you can also refer to the findings of other researchers. If people have already done research, you may use those findings, and those findings are often in databases. NIDS, NIDS, is a database. It's a project at UCT where they have, I think it's a more or less annual or every second year, they have an interview with people that looks at their health, and how they spent their money, and how the way that they have spent their money have changed over time. So it's a good idea to, before you take the trouble to go to all kinds of lengths, to have interviews and everything where they, and then of course the census information, and there is a lot of places where you can find data which you can and the data sometimes have already been analyzed, which you can use for your research. And then, of course, the results of your own practical experiments. And then, don't forget about non-academic texts. Those can be law reports, financial statements. It can even be a report from a social worker, because the non-academic texts, often you can use, that's where we get our case studies. So I know most of you are going to have all kinds of interviews, but remember there are other ways of having data to research. And then, of course, your own professional experience. If you have been through 3 or 4, you've been done a CA, and you have been to 3 or 4 audits, you have professional experience and you can speak about it. If you have been a social worker at the children's home, you have experience and you may use your experience. But remember, it doesn't matter how you gather your data. 2 requirements. It must be the best practice in your discipline. And the other one is that you have to know the limitations of your collection of data. How can you from that move to the general, or what kind of solution can you give? I'm going to use the example of a children's home. I live in Durbanville, and the children's home is very much not the children itself. We're not that kind of community, which is a pity. But it's the community really supports the children's home with donations and money-wise, clothes-wise, they really get a lot of donations. Whereas in a neighboring town, they also have a children's home, but somehow that children's home is separate from the community. The community, I think, has more or less the same average income as Durbanville, where I live, but that community is not as involved with the children's home as we are. And so you will have 2 social workers having completely different experiences. Now, both are professional experience, but there's a limit to what kind of conclusion they can make from their professional experience. So your professional experience is valid, but it has limitations, and in your methodology and the rest of your research, you need to be aware of those limitations. When we take our logical argument, there must be balance. And the balance is, first of all, physical, the distribution of information. I can remember in my undergrad years, I once nearly failed an assignment because I spent something like 2 or 3 pages explaining why my dear wasn't an example of affection in that short story. I did not distribute my information properly. That means that when you read the assignment, you have to read the underlying message. Where does this examiner want me to focus? And the other one is there should be balance intellectually. You should have both sides of the issue. If you look at this assignment, outline the problems likely to arise from the introduction of larger lecture classes and discuss the possible solutions. I underlined the 2 verbs. Do you see outline requires a shorter or less of the assignment than discuss, because in discuss they want you to have more than one. You have to have a nuanced argument for and against, implications, consequences. That is under discuss, whereas outline they don't want the details. You just need to sketch the problem situation, and then you move towards the possible solutions and you give the advantages and disadvantages. I just need to check whether there are any questions at this moment. No, you seem to know everything. The balance in your argument comes about when you anticipate possible objections to your reasons or evidence. I don't know how many of you saw that interview with Proudfoot. I think it would be a good idea to go to Google it, because if you haven't seen it, because it's a good example of how it's a good example of how he gave the objections to social distancing. It wasn't in an academic way, but at least you can see how some of the structures, how it works when you refute an argument. So you have to accept, or you have to show that you had a look at the possible objections to your reasons or evidence. And then you have to show that you have considered those objections. You can't simply say they're too expensive or it's against the law. Because those are very shallow objections to those are very shallow objections against solutions or opinions. And then you have to use counter arguments. If you look at the current argument around cigarette sales or not, it has now, there is a medical argument, and then there's the social argument. I knew working class people share cigarettes, but I would never have thought of banning cigarettes for that reason. So we have all kinds of arguments, and read the better newspapers, the good newspapers, and listen, especially John Matham is a journalist on Cape Talk, and he has the ability to present both points of view and then come to a conclusion. It is not really on an academic standard, but it is an introduction on how do you refute an argument. Counter arguments and anticipating counter arguments. And here we get to a few of the phrases. Opponents or critics of this position may or might argue that. And do you see it's a different take on that? One may conclude that. Another phrase is, another argument against X is. So here in this part, we make sure that we think of counter arguments. And do you follow my argument or my reasoning that if I give you these phrases, that it leads towards interpretation and not mere copying of the ideas? It may be objected that one possible objection is that several questions come to mind. One might ask or wonder whether. Certain objections must, of course, be considered. And what I want you to see is with how much respect the opinions, the counter arguments are treated. There's again a microphone on. Will you please put it off? Mute yourself. How do you prevent bias when you do research? It's the first thing in that case, when I did my honors years ago with UNISA, I can remember still the lecture about the difference between assumptions. If I do research in second language teaching, I assume that people want to improve their English. And it is with that assumption that I start. But prejudice or bias has to do with like and dislike. So one way to prevent bias is by going through these counter arguments and to read outside your area of comfort, to read outside your comfort zone. I suppose you've heard I'm not a Trump supporter, but I will watch Fox News to see what arguments do they have. It's the same. I don't really like independent newspapers. I'm disappointed in what they've become. But I'll read the Weekend Argus because I need to know what people think who think differently. Okay, that's my work. I can't do my work unless I know what other people think. So it's kind of my job to listen to Fox News. I need to listen to read the Argus, because I need, in my work, I need to be able to cope with different opinions. So I think the first thing is that you read outside your comfort zone. It also has to do with being self-aware. When I started working for UNISA, I can remember how deeply relieved I was that I had to report, and that was many years ago, how deeply relieved I was when I realized that the person in charge of that department was a woman. I just thought it's easier to report to a woman. Since then, I've changed my mind, but you need to be aware of your biases if you want to manage them. You can't, if you go out, Maintjies, Mr. or Mrs. Maintjies asked, and maybe just gather facts that prove your hypothesis. If you go out and you looked for facts that support your hypothesis, you will find them. If I think it's easier to report to a woman, I will find anecdotes and examples to prove that. If I think men make better managers, I will find evidence to support that. So you cannot gather facts to prove your hypothesis. That's why your methodology should be of such that you gather facts, and then from the facts you come to a conclusion which either support or refute your hypothesis. But you can't gather facts to support your argument. A glaring example that we have of that is that deeply racist people are all of a sudden very concerned about the long lines for soup kitchens. 2-3 months ago, they couldn't be bothered whether there are soup kitchens in the poor areas, but now they need facts to support the argument that they should open the economy. So all of a sudden, now the long lines at the soup kitchen bother them. So if we look for facts that support our hypothesis, we will find them. And that's the difference between research and looking for a reason. The other one is, I'll see if I can move. Will these lessons be made available afterwards as a review mechanism? Yes, that's why John interrupted me. It is recorded and it's posted. That chat, that if you look on the screen, if you click on that chat, you ought to find all the recordings there. So here we have an example of the structures that we can use to anticipate the counter arguments. Now, when we refute them, the good old but, on the other hand, however, nevertheless, this is merely, while this may be true in cases where, and I love this one, the lady or the gentleman who asked the question about bias, do you see that if you use this structure, while this may be true in cases where it does not apply to, you already start attacking or defending yourself against bias. While this is valid for part-time staff, it surely does not apply in the case of full-time workers. So do you see how these structures take your thought processes in a certain direction? And say, for instance, you've worked over the weekend, we're back in the open economy, for the whole week you're too busy, and you go back to what you've written and you see the structures, you know, okay, I was in the process, I was working with the counter arguments. And it's also a way of helping you when you had to interrupt your writing, or so that you can go back and take your logical thread further. Now, I want to speak about the introduction, especially the introduction to the short assignment. I get nervous when you do not ask questions. I have this idea, you use me as a radio and you're sitting in the garden with a cup of coffee and you're not really listening. So I get very nervous when you don't ask questions. What is it that prevents you from asking questions? Am I speaking outside your field of interest, or what is the problem? Because usually you ask far more questions than these. Don't be nervous, we are here chewing on our lunch sandwiches. Okay, and you don't speak with your mouth full. Okay, we'll live with that. And very new to this, yes, it is a new way of thinking. But let's go back. We have a complicated process that we are going through. And the biggest problem is that it's not a linear process. So we are like people wandering up and down in a big supermarket. If we don't have a proper shopping list, and we don't use our shopping list and those indicators that they have above the aisles to indicate what it is, if we don't line that up, we are going to waste a lot of time and get home with only half of the things that we needed to buy. And I go to one supermarket for the very reason that I can actually walk in, collect what I need and get out. So if by accident I need to go to another supermarket, I'm lost. For those of you who think of research as you are going to go through a new supermarket, you need to find your way. And like you will look on a shopping list and see, I still need to buy eggs. These words and phrases takes you become, yes, the words and phrases become like those indicator banners that they have in the aisles. You don't need to walk up and down all the aisles. You look at the phrases, but on the other hand, so I am in the refuting phase, and you start refuting the arguments. I've finished with the counter arguments, and now I refute them. I like this one's sense of humor. Getting better by the time. So you are now getting so good. One of these days I'm out of a job. I'll never ever forgive you. Because as you know, the economy might open one or other time, and then I'm going to need the money. So there are two kinds. Some of you start off your module with short assignments. And ladies and gentlemen, you cannot make enough effort with your introduction, because the introduction tells the reader whether you've planned properly and whether you are on the right track. So the introduction is very, very important. In the introduction, usually have a general orientation in which we explain the situation, we state the problem, and we have a possible solution. The example that I compiled would be something like that. What is the situation? In South Africa, we have 11 official languages, with English being the lingua franca. That means it's the language understood by most of the people, or often used. The problem is that when we have people speaking in their second language to other people in their who will answer them in their second language, you often have misunderstandings and you often have conflict. And I experienced it very literally, because there was a time when I worked in the admin in a factory, and honestly, I thought some people were incredibly rude. If I had the guts at that time, they would have been up for a disciplinary or a grievance or whatever. And afterwards, I realized, but within that group, these words are quite acceptable. So what is the situation? 11 languages with the and the bridge between those languages is often English. But because several groups communicate with English as a second language, there's often misunderstanding, and that can even lead to conflict. The solution would be that one cannot assume that you only need to teach people in South Africa to understand British English or American English or Southern Suburb English, whatever you want to call it. We also need to teach people in South Africa how to cope with other second language speakers from a different area or group. And that then is my general orientation And from there, I move on. The solution I suggested that you should teach people not only to improve their English, but also to understand other second language speakers better. And the evaluation then in that case would be, if you have such a program for 18 months, you can, in a school, you can look, did the conflict on the playground, did that improve? If you take the number of instances of conflict before the program, if you compare it to after the program, how will I evaluate my solution? But the introduction to a thesis is a different kettle of fish. So for those of you doing your masters, or you have done the introduction to research already, and you now only have to submit your big honors thesis, this is what your introduction should look like. The introduction, stage 1, is the orientation. Do you remember when you did your literature review, that the introduction is, you have the abstract, you have this, what do they call it? It's not an A4 page. It is a short, what is it? A3, A2, where you have the page, half an A4 page. Then you have the abstract on top, and then it's more or less the rest of the page, and the half of the next page is the introduction. Now, the first part of the introduction, stage 1, is the orientation. And then you have your general statements, your background information, and your reference to previous studies. If we take my example that we've had, I would have a general statement in which I acknowledge that for a long time there were only 2 official languages, but after 1994 it was changed to 11 official languages. But as a result of the history, English is the language that we use if we have to communicate across language lines. The background information would be then refer to the demographics of South Africa. For instance, in the Northwestern Cape, you don't find many people who speak English. And you would refer to how many people have English as a first language and how many people understand English. And you would refer to previous studies and what their feeling was about communication between language groups. Then you move on to your justification. What is the gap? If we look at this one, you referred to previous studies. Your next phrase, you indicate the gap. Because it's all good and well to say, when you go home, you speak whatever language you want. That's a basic human right. But what happens if the solution to the problem, how do I communicate when I go to Pick n Pay? Then I speak English. But what if that solution actually only exacerbates the problem, that the person to whom I speak English might feel insulted by the English that I use? What are the questions and problems around this gap? And then what would be the value of further discussion? And then in stage 3, you focus on your paper. How do you set about with your paper? What will be your research questions? What would be the central idea? The central idea in my approach, I'll never even try to do the real research, but the central idea would be that we should teach the students to understand instead of to be understood. And the question about the bias, you see that in my very approach now, because I have this idea that if I want to communicate, it's better for me to understand the other one's point of view than to always make my point of view clear and to convince somebody else that I'm right. And can you see how I need to be aware of that? I sometimes avoid conflict if I want to be unbiased in my research. So in the focus on my paper, I give the central idea, the structure. How am I going to do it? Will it be an addition to the normal English second language classes? Will it become part of life orientation? Will I expose the teachers as well as the children to this program? What kind of structure am I going to follow? And the next one, what would be the limitations of my study? For instance, if I do the study that I now proposed, if I do that in a private school usually has a very homogeneous population because the parents must all have at least the same basic income to able to afford the school fees of a private school. If you look at a school like Kiro, because that's a private school close to me, the parents more or less drive the same car or the same price car. The parents are more or less dressed the same. Of course, even in a school like Kiro, you still have very rich and ordinary rich people, but it's still far more homogeneous than the closest Model C school. So if I do this at Kiro, it will be, I won't necessarily be able to apply that to work done at the local Model C school, because in the Model C school, we have children who walk to school merely because their parents don't have cars. We have matrics coming to school with their own cars, two-door cars, sunroof cars. It's quite a wealthy environment. So you have, except for the group difference, you have a very strong class difference, income difference. So there are severe limitations. On my research, I can't say that it will change an approach that worked at Kiro will always work at a school, an ordinary Model C school. And whether it will work at the, what do they call them, quintile 5, the schools that can't pay school fees, whether that approach will work there. Do you see the limitations? Method, evaluation. So that's what you have in your introduction. Now, I want you to pay attention when you report, and if I remember correctly, that the class is going to stop more or less here. When you report what somebody has said, you need to report correctly, and that comes in with a reporting verb. There's a difference between saying he claimed that, he commented that, and he stated that. Do you see the difference? That when the authoritative researcher that you're quoting, if that person is doubtful, it's different from neutral, and it's different from being very certain about it. So here are some reporting verbs. Now, what I would suggest is that even if you have submitted your literature review, go back to where you report on the findings that you've read about in your literature review and see which of these words would actually upgrade your literature review. Or if you are still busy, look at it. Because do you see, if I have to change to choose between support and refute, does he support the argument or does he refute the argument? The moment that I start choosing my reporting verb, I automatically start interpreting the work, and I immediately start moving away from plagiarism to interpretation. Look at the difference between I hold the opinion and research showed that. So when you go back to your literature review and to some of the articles and look at the reporting verbs, and I also want you to have a look at the function of the justification. This one about the counter arguments. Go back to one of the articles you've read for your literature review and look how these phrases are applied, and then look at your own literature review and see if these phrases would have upgraded your literature review. So the idea that I want to leave with you is, first of all, that academic writing differs from other genres, and it is like learning to write in a different way. It has a specific structure and it has specific conventions. and the words and phrases that we use grounds us and tell us where we are in the structure, and the conventions keep us safe. If I force myself to cite and reference carefully, I protect myself against plagiarism. If I set up my table of contents properly, my argument will be logical. If I have a proper bibliography, people can check my references. So the structure and the convention protect us in a way against bias. Of course, it's very difficult. Much of the research done around anthropology during the 60s and 70s have been so discredited, but that is part of the academic debate. Beliefs that I had yesterday aren't necessarily true anymore. And it's part of growing up to realize that you are not right. And if you are right at the wrong time, it's very uncomfortable. Now, after that bit of philosophy, ladies and gentlemen, now you have 5 more minutes to ask me a few questions. Okay, Gail finds it interesting. Let me see here. What would be the best way to phrase a hypothesis? Where is that? When using, for example, that grounded theory, I looked it up and now I can't remember exactly what it is, and qualitative methods. Oh, that one. And when investigating life satisfaction in retirement in your introduction, do you have to have your hypothesis in your introduction, or should you have your thesis statement? Because there's the thesis statement has a definite structure. It is usually by claiming this and that and that, it is supposed that. That's more or less the structure of the thesis statement. So I don't know whether it's Mr. or Mrs. Fono. I suggest that you have a careful look at your instructions, because I don't think that the hypothesis is in the introduction. I think it comes after the introduction, and that you have your thesis statement in your introduction. But look carefully at your at your tutorial letter, whether they want the hypothesis in the introduction. Any other questions? Ladies and gentlemen, did I give you too much information? I am very nervous because usually you're quite a chatty group. I'm still a bit confused about the deductions. Gail, what we do when we are confused, we go to Google. I think I can use, just tell me in your in the chat, if I go away from the PowerPoint, will you be able to see Google? Because what you can do then is define arrived at a fact or a conclusion, draw as a logical conclusion. That means that you have an enormous lot of information, and from that you either analyze it, you come to a conclusion. So it works like a funnel. Could you see how? And then there was a question about, can you please explain again how you link your paragraphs, that is showing your golden thread. If I'm going to go to the big chat, because this chat is only for this meeting, but if you go to files, why aren't they here? Oh, I suppose they've changed them. Do you see here transitional words and phrases? You need to decide, how do I move? What is the link between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2? And here we have the words. If it is that I made an argument in paragraph 1 and I want to compare it to something else, I can start by the same token. Similarly, in my first paragraph, I wrote about conflict as a result of second language communication in small schools. Similarly, bigger, well-known schools have the same problem. And then that similarly tell the reader that in this paragraph, you are going to compare. Paragraph 1, I wrote about conflict in certain schools as a result of second language communication. By contrast, I want to explain that in other schools, they do not have the same kind of conflict. Nonetheless, just across the street in the Model C school, can you see I'm telling my reader or listener how to move with me. Sorry. So I do hope that helped you, Bianca, that you at least can see how we use it, and I'll make a note of it that we address the problem in the next lecture. Any other questions? So, I know quite a few of you have to submit papers on Friday the 8th. but it's really a good idea to have your assignments read before they go in. I do not comment on the content because it's not my field of expertise. But by applying the rules and structures I've discussed with you, I can evaluate whether your argument makes sense. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I can see whether it makes sense at this stage. So off you go. Now I can make my sandwich for lunch. And please think of questions for next time. I get very, very nervous when you're so quiet. Be good and stay safe.